As I said, this is Will, everyone, and we are here for a session on market mix modelling, which has increased, recently as a tool for assessing digital advertising effectiveness. So historically been used to assess traditional forms of media, but having a resurgence right now due to a few things that Will's going to explain about soon, which means that, it is being used for digital advertising effectiveness quite a lot. And this session is really to give you a bit of the foundational understanding, but also how media owners in particular can facilitate a smooth transition of data to research vendors such as Mutinex to ensure that their activities is fairly represented in these models. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Will, who's going to present for about half an hour. Will, do you think?
That sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah, and then we've got plenty of time then for a chat. So you can hold off your questions to the end, and you can shout, and Will can definitely answer them when he's finished his presentation. So I'll hand over to you, Will. You're up on screen and good to go.
Fantastic. Okay, so good to be here and getting underway. And thanks so much for joining this session where we're talking about the essential concepts and data inputs for market mix modeling. A little bit of an agenda. So yes, we're going to be talking about measurement through market mix models, how we're inferring the incrementality of media, the secrets to a great market mix model, and how we can make sure that we're accurately representing data and reflecting accurate results in the outputs. So that's measurement, but we also want to make sure that we're helping our customers see growth through measurement as well. So we want to be going from those insights into impacts. We want to be helping them optimize their channel mix and their executions. And we also just want to help them actually build a growth roadmap. But actually, some of the things we really want to do today is helping you start to think more like a model. So this, as a modeling approach, it works in a certain way, and it really helps us to start kind of thinking the same way that a model thinks in terms of how it interprets the data that it receives. And then in terms of how you use it, I'll be honest, my knowledge about football is pretty terrible. I'm a bit of an embarrassment to, as an Englishman. Everyone asks me who my favorite team are. I don't have a football team, but I still see some kind of relationships to how you manage a football team and how you manage a channel mix, because ultimately you're trying to get the best team on the field for your money. You're trying to make sure they're all performing as strongly as they can be, etc. So we'll go into that in a bit more detail. But before we do, at Mutinex, we think of ourselves as, a pretty on the bleeding edge of tech, etc. So I thought I'd better try and make this presentation as advanced as I could. So I decided to try and train up my own GPT to help me do this. So I trained it up in all things econometrics, Bayesian hierarchical models, etc., to look at how it could help me bring this presentation to life a little bit. And it has provided me with a very glamorous assistant who is called Roger. And so Roger's going to be helping us throughout this presentation, ultimately trying to bring to life what the world of econometrics is all about and how we can help use it to drive growth for our customers. So Roger can sit at the very heart of this story, because one of the questions every marketer wants answered is which advert actually made Roger buy a product. In this case, someone's dancing shoes. Roger went online and he purchased some dancing shoes. And maybe he was thinking about an advert he saw on his phone, maybe that same day or maybe the day before. But for so many marketers, it's just this question of how did we influence an outcome? But the problem that we have in measurement, and measurement is hard because there's so many things that can lead to that outcome. Roger has potentially been on a bit of a journey. Maybe he saw some great shoes at a disco he went to. Maybe he got a recommendation from one of his dancing friends. Maybe he did see an ad on Meta that did have an impact on his likelihood of purchase. Maybe he then went on and searched a brand name on Google or did some other searching that led to that final purchase of those shoes. There's so many things that might have happened, and it's so hard to actually understand how each of those might have influenced and how much impact we should be attributing to each of those situations. And in order to understand how marketing drives sales, we need more than just a few digital footprints. It takes more than just looking at some of the ads that he's been exposed to, or maybe tracking where he's been online, etc. It takes a bit more than just seeing where he's had some exposure to ads. We need a lot more information. And that's where to date, multi-attribution has always been a bit flawed. Yes, there are lots of headaches for it at the moment in terms of cookie deprecation, Apple's transparency tracking, etc. I'm not even going to start talking about those because they've been talked about so much recently. For me, the most important fact is that attribution tends to have very simplistic logic to it. Or even in data-driven attribution, it's still having to make conclusions based on quite limited amounts of data. So the inherent problem we have with attribution, and many of you would have seen these kind of charts before, is that in attribution, marketing can be given the full credit for a sales outcome if there's been an associated exposure to a customer. But actually, we should be looking at the contribution of media, and that's when we're looking at the incrementality of media. So we know that some sales would have occurred with or without that ad exposure to Roger. We know that there's external events we should be thinking about, whether that's just seasonal fluctuations, maybe the impact of inflation, cash rates increases, etc., are all having an effect. We know promotions have such an enormous effect on sales in certain industries, and it's so important to be considering. And then finally, we have that incremental effect of marketing. And that's where we're looking at the incrementality of media. And that's what econometrics are all about, ultimately. So market mix models, ultimately, they just don't really care about Roger. They don't want to know exactly what Roger got exposed to in his online browsing, etc. They're not trying to track him, not trying to follow him around and see what he's been doing, listen in and see what he's been exposed to. What they do care about is all the things that might have affected the sale of those dancing shoes. So we're not interested in what Roger's up to. We're interested about the world that those shoes exist in, and ultimately what's driving the sales of those shoes. So let's go through actually how that's actually working in the world of market mix models. So one question we often see is that people say, well, MMMs, they're just about correlation then, are they? So you're looking at the sales outcomes and you're looking at your media activity that you've been running, and you're looking for the relationship between the two. If it's correlation, how then can you say is causation? Because we know that if you're just looking at the relation of things, it doesn't necessarily mean that one thing caused the other. Well, MMMs, we see that MMMs infer the causal drivers of sales for understanding ultimately what the world looks like if media didn't exist. And then, as I say, there's that incremental impact of sales when you do have media out there. So when you've got your sales line over time and it might be quite jagged, we look at base sales. We look at external factors that might be positive or negative, seasonal fluctuations, promotions, and then that incremental effect of media, whether that's significant media spend or some of the smaller media spend. And then you can strip away everything else. I know that all happened quite quickly, but I'll just play again. So yeah, looking at building up where all those sales are coming from, and then looking at that incremental effect of media. And then, so if you strip away base, and if you strip away the effect of seasonality and external factors, etc., you're left with this pattern of sales that we're seeing from your media. And then you can see what revenue we can be attributing to TV that was above and beyond everything else, the spend that you put into that activity, and then, therefore, what your return of investment was. And you can do this across all channels, ultimately. Every channel can be treated in exactly the same way. And ultimately, that's why it's such a popular methodology at the moment, because it means that everything can be measured on an apples for apples basis. We're not using one measurement solution for one channel and trying to compare that to the performance of a channel measured using some other type of approach. So everything can be measured in the same way. Now, for models, in order to do this, they love variety. It's the spice of life for them. So the two things that they really like to see, they like to see variations over time. So in order to understand how all those things are coming together, they like to see and look to understand, as I say, what the world looks like when you haven't got media present, what it looks like when you've got tailwinds in the market, like you've got macroeconomic effects that are helping your industry, or what the world looks like when you have those headwinds and actually the sales conditions are a bit tougher at those times. It loves to look at different levels of media spend across different media channel mixes. The more variation that you have, the more the model has to try and understand all the different drivers of those sales. And then it also wants to have coverage. So in order for a model to correctly attribute sales back to a source, we need to have some information about that activity. So we want to make sure that we're looking to try and cover the most important factors that drive the sales, let's say of shoes, and making sure that those are inputs into the model. If we're not including those most important factors, it then removes information that the model needs. And it gets harder to understand the incremental effect of your media because you're not accounting properly for all the other factors that could be driving sales. So there's so many things to consider, and it's not always about trying to put in absolutely as much as possible. So for any industry or advertiser, you want to be looking at what the most important things to be considering are. So it's often extremely important to be thinking about the discountings that they run, any offers they have in market, their pricing, and how competitive their pricing is against their competitors. Obviously, we want to be looking at their paid media, their sponsorship, owned and earned where relevant, and bringing all that information in. That's going to give us a really good picture of how their overall marketing activity is performing. And then in non-marketing, again, it's where you want to look at what factors are most important in that industry. To what extent is inflation going to be a key driver? Levels of employment, footfall if we're looking at retailers, etc. Seasonality, ASX movement, whether there's a lot of activity that we can be including. Ultimately, for Mutinex, this is where our strengths lie in looking and having the data warehouses that have all this information and having the industry expertise to know which information is most critical across different industries. And then in order to get to this final MOM picture, how are different levels of media activity driving performance? There's two key relationships a market mix model looks for between your spend and your revenue outcome. The first is looking to build a picture of what the return on media spend is on revenue at different levels of spend. And so that builds out these saturation curves, which you might be familiar with, which show that as you increase spend, you will reach this point of optimal spend where that line is at its steepest. So that means for every dollar you're putting into marketing, you're getting more and more revenue back. But then you hit that point of diminishing returns. You start to oversaturate. And actually you see that as you put a further dollar and another dollar in, you're not getting a dollar back. And that return you're getting is getting smaller and smaller. We also want to understand the impact over time of media, because we know that it's not just about activating spend in market and seeing return in that week. It's about looking at the delayed effect of your media spend. We call them ad stocks. So looking at as you have your media market, how your spend is as your revenue is increasing over time, when it peaks and when it starts to delay, and looking for that length of the ad stock. What is the total duration of that activity? So for media data, when you're thinking about what information is going to be critical, there's three things that we want to be thinking about. Firstly, when it comes to media, it's so important that we think about the actual exposure of your media. So the model wants to know when the activity actually happened. We don't want to look at when it was booked or what was planned. We want to know what actually happened. And we want to see the magnitude of that data. So the model can see when we had lots or little amounts of media. It's so important, it should go without saying, but it's so important to be thinking about the fact that the data has to be complete. If you've got holes in your data, the model is completely unaware that that activity existed. It's not going to fill in the blanks for you. So by missing data, it could lead to the model having more uncertainty about where to attribute those results, and it could result in a model attributing those sales elsewhere. And then lastly, it's also so important to think about what the objective orientation was of that media. It's completely incorrect to just be looking at a channel and class it all as the same when we know that if that channel has been executed using some brand approach versus a performance approach, the outcomes should be extremely different. And so a model wants to be able to differentiate between your funnel stage, ultimately, of your media. When is that channel being used for some upper funnel activity, some mid funnel, and some lower funnel? That's going to give it a much more accurate picture of the saturation curves of the channel at those different objectives, and the ad stocks of those channels for those different objectives. So no one channel doesn't necessarily always perform in the same way. We want to make sure we've categorized it as appropriate. And the flighting, capturing this flighting is so critical to a model. I just wanted to play a little example here. So let's say, and this is an instance that we can see quite often for, let's say, out of home. We just see one spike of spend put in for out of home on one particular week. The model's ad stock on that isn't going to be accurate. It's going to show a much shorter ad stock, and it will probably show a very inefficient performance for that media. The bottom chart is actually showing that that one spend should have been distributed across 4 weeks rather than just 1 week. And then the model's able to build a much more accurate ad stock for that activity because it sees the duration of that activity and it can see the full ad stock duration. You would then see a much better performance for that channel. So making sure that you're accurately representing the flighting of your media is so critical. Again, the model's not going to be filling in the gaps for you. It needs to have the most accurate information possible in order to deliver the most accurate results possible. So, measurement. Let me just recap a couple of those points. Thinking like a model, you want to be thinking about the factors that are most important to your industry or for an advertiser. It's so critical. For media, to get the most accurate understanding of the incrementality of your media, you may want to make sure the data is as accurate as possible. And also the variation in data just gives the model so much more to be feeding from. So if you're not running an MMM now, but you think you might be in the future, because as everyone says, the future is modeled, you want to start thinking about how you can start injecting some levels of variation into your media activity, so that when it comes to using modeled approaches, it's got a rich history of data to look back on and improve its understanding of how the world ultimately works. So let's go through how we can actually turn some of that measurement and looking at the impact of media into what a customer should actually do, and then how publishers, agencies, advertisers should all start to work together on these results so that advertisers can then start to improve performance going forwards. Now, I love this quote from Nate Silver. You might have seen it before. Numbers have no way of speaking for themselves. We speak for them. We imbue them with meaning. Now, I've always had a career in data as an analyst, consultant, etc. And everyone wants to be data driven. But the value from data comes from when you're able to overlay the context onto data and understand what's driving those numbers. So the more that we can have the context and understanding of those numbers that, for us, Growth OS is telling us about the performance of media, the more actionable that information becomes. And the better able we are to start turning those numbers into something tangible that we can action upon and deliver into growth. So at Mutinex, we have our marketing science team, and we like to work closely with advertisers, agencies, publishers to better understand the results that we're seeing so we can give better recommendations on how to make the best decisions from that data. So data and insights is just one part of it. Making sure that we have this flow into decisions being made is actually where the rubber hits the road, and this is the part that really matters to customers. For market mix models, there's 3 ways that ultimately they deliver value to customers. One of their main strengths is in strategic planning. So understanding what marketing is giving back versus what you're putting in helps advertisers set budgets, because they've got a much better understanding now of what the return of that marketing is and what the return could be if they increased or decreased those budgets. It can help them understand their brand versus performance dilemma, because we can see that actually brand activity does drive sales in the short term. And then understanding how you can still hit a target by getting that right balance of brand investment versus performance investment is so powerful to unlock. The classic use of market mix models is in channel mix, looking at how you get the best optimal mix of channels, given that you're comparing them directly to each other, and then sponsorships, etc., or even pricing. The list goes on from there. The action customers should be taking, and if you're ever working with a market mix model or with people that use market mix models, you want to be looking at what strategic tests you can be using. So taking those insights, building hypothesis off the back of them, putting tests into market that you can then validate and prove that that hypothesis is true. Then tactical optimizations. And this is where, when market mix models start to get refreshed on a more regular cadence, at Mutinex we run them on a monthly basis, it allows you to check in on your campaigns and see how they're performing month to month. And that allows you to then start making some of these tactical changes to start ensuring those channels are delivering what you need them to deliver, or start overperforming where possible. So getting your right level of spend on those channels, making sure you got the right publisher mix, let's say within within BVOD, within video, etc. Which publishers are you actually using, making sure they're working together as effectively as possible. Formats in digital, there are just so many different permutations of how you can execute. So starting to build out this analysis of which formats and asset types work hard for you is incredibly valuable to unlock. And then for some customers, looking at it at the geography level, starting to look at different states, regional versus metro, etc., that can then start to unlock some more learnings. And again, I'm always a big advocate for running tactical tests. If you see some insight that looks potentially valuable, put it into market, test it. You can test it directly through the market mix model, or you might want to use the rest of your measurement solution repertoire, maybe using lift tests, whether that's randomized control trials, geo-lift tests, etc. Look at how you can validate those insights. And the third part that market mix models deliver value is it holds people accountable. So now they can be looking at reviewing the sales drivers. They can take the correct amount of credit for what marketing delivered. They can look back at how their campaign performed, or how they performed over the most recent quarter, and make sure that they're hitting their expectations. And if they're not, looking for those opportunities to improve. And this is where we start coming into the part of thinking about your media planning, a bit like you're managing a football team. As I said at the start, you want to be getting the best team on the field that your budget can afford ultimately. And you also want to make sure that each of those players are performing as strongly as they possibly can. You want to be getting the very best from each of those players. And you want to be tracking it. It's not just about putting that team on the field and walking away and saying, that'll be absolutely fine for my season. You want to be making sure that you're seeing how they're performing week in, week out, where they start to become poor value for money, not performing as optimally as you need them to. So start thinking about how your channels are working together as a team. And a great way of viewing this is on this cross-tab view of looking at how efficient a channel is and how much is it contributing to your media. So how much is contributing, saying how important that channel is. And if you took it away, what the impact would be to the revenue that you're receiving as a business. And then you can overlay some strategies for each of those channels. So something's in the bottom left, it's not being very efficient, it's not contributing much. You probably want to look at, can you coach that channel? Look at the formats, look at how it's being executed. Can you shift it to the right? Maybe it's the creative, and look at what you can do to make that channel start to work quite efficiently for you. If you do that, then you start to move into number two. You're looking really efficient, but you're not contributing very much. So that's when you want to look at, is there an opportunity to scale that channel? Can you start investing more, maintain efficiency, and get much more contribution from it? If you're in that top left, it's important for you, but it's doing, that channel is contributing a large amount of revenue very inefficiently. There's a very strong likelihood that you're over-investing in it, and that if you were to reduce your investment in that channel, you could reduce your spend and make it more efficient without losing a lot of contribution from that channel. So you want to look at opportunities there. And if you're in the top right, that's exactly where you want to be. You're efficient, you're important. That's where you're trying to drive all your channels and your players into that space. And this is where we come back to the saturation curves. So if you want to look at, can you scale a channel, or what would be the impact if you reduced your investment on a channel? This is where saturation curves are going to be the insight for that decision. So as I say, you want to be at the top of that vertical part of the curve. That's going to be your optimal ROI before you start hitting that point of diminishing returns. So the questions you should be asking of a saturation curve is, can I increase the spend on a channel and maintain this efficiency? And will a channel become more efficient if I were to decrease spend on it? There's so many test and learn opportunities here because a saturation curve is built based off your historic data. So if you've only ever used a channel in a fairly confined way, using a fairly consistent level of spend on that channel, you're going to want to run a test of that channel at a higher level of spend. Maybe a test at 10 or 20% higher spend than what you previously used to do. That's going to give the model more information to build out how that curve extrapolates out and give you more confidence in the performance of that channel at at increased levels further. So looking at how a channel's been used in the past, looking at what experiments you can run to give you more information about how that channel could be used in the future. And then within each channel, it's not just about spend, it's about how you're using it. So diving into this in a bit more detail, within every channel, you should be able to break it down through an MMM to say, what if I use 6-second assets? What if I use reels or 15 seconds or a static image? How did that perform? Likewise, looking at publishers, geographies, looking across your past campaigns. This is going to give you a bit of a meta-analysis of everything that you've run in the past and what's worked the best for you, and then starting to lean towards those best performing executions going forwards. Again, there's so many opportunities here to test and to learn. They're historical looking. They're not going to tell you how something's worked if you've never tried it. So you need to put executions into market and then measure to see how did they perform. It also goes for totally new channels. If you've never used a channel before, the model will not estimate what the outcome would be for that channel. So you have to test, you have to trial them, see how they perform. And then that allows you, the model, to give you more information back. And it's so important to not just be trying to optimize within your own echo chamber, just optimizing within what you've done in the past. The industry we work in is so complex. There's so many channels, so many different publishers, so many different executions that you can run. You want to be looking at where you should venture into new areas. One way we often see customers use this is by using their budget split across a 70-20-10 rule, where 70% of their budget goes into BAU, 20% goes into running a test based off insight they've seen in the past, and 10% go into trying something totally new to see how something might work that they've never really tried before, but which the industry is telling them is performing well at the moment. So for our customers, they're seeing success in this area. So for UE, looking at how looking at what the headroom is for channels, allowing them to double down and spend on certain channels. For Mars, looking at the breakdowns, looking at how different formats worked and how they can start optimizing towards different formats. So there's so much that can be done. It's also so important to approach this in a nice, strategic, methodical way. So rather than every month when your model gets refreshed, trying to do absolutely everything, we recommend to customers that they approach this by embedding it into the decisions that they're already trying to make. So when they're running annual planning, look at where they should be integrating market mix models outputs into. When they run quarterly reviews of their plan, so looking forwards, can they run a new forecast using the likes of Scenario Builder, so predicting what the outcome is going to be of their plan. Looking back, they can be looking at how did they perform, where were the tailwinds, where were the headwinds, how did that impact the efficiency of their media, what were the results of their large strategic tests. And then on a quarterly basis, looking at how each of those campaigns performed and any tactical test results that they've got coming through. And then within each campaign, you can also be looking at tactical optimizations you can be making along the way, just making those slight steering decisions to keep you on track. So for customers, they can build out a bit of a roadmap that might look something like this, saying we're going to be using market mix models for this purpose in these months, and for these purposes in other months. And that just starts to make it more tangible understanding who's responsible at which point in time, where they're going to be driving value from measurement from. Again, otherwise, there's no shortage of data in our industry. We've all got a huge number of numbers that we could be working with. So making sure we're using the right numbers for the right decisions and approaching it in a fairly strategic framework like this is what's really going to help customers. I hope that's proved useful. So I just want to say thank you, and thank you from Roger on this. I hope there's been something new in there, or helped cement some learnings you've had in the past. I'd love now just to take any questions you guys have and answer them as best I can.
Thank you so much, Will. Now we can either take questions. I believe you can raise your hand, or you can also pop your question in the Q&A. So I'll just
got one in there, Nat.
Open up this Q&A for you. Okay. So we have question here. What would you like to see more and or less of from publishers when working with clients on MMMs to deliver effective customer outcomes? What do you need from publishers, Will?
Publishers have so much context behind how channels can perform. So let's say a digital publisher will know the best practices for buying a channel. So they're going to be able to provide the best advice on why a channel has performed in a certain way. So you want to involve publishers to say, we're seeing performance change over time. Why are we seeing performance for this channel increase or decrease at these times when we've used different buying approaches? Publishers just have such a wealth of knowledge to say, we can see at certain times of year you've bought in this using this approach, this execution practice, and that's not against our best practices, or it's giving us new information to say, let's go away and do a test. So ultimately, publishers should be coming in with their expertise on what makes a channel really perform as exceptionally well as possible. Give people recommendations on how to squeeze more out of that channel, and then put that into testing and prove that it actually comes back to be more growth for that customer.
Just a further one from the publisher perspective. Do you have the ability to amalgamate performance insights, and are there ways to collaborate with you as a publisher? So can publishers collaborate with Mutinex?
I'd love to collaborate with publishers on, again, just finding out what their recommendations are that we should also be talking about with customers in terms of how to get the most out of channels. I'm doing my best to become as much of an expert in every channel as possible, but there is a lot out there. So I would love people to reach out and say, come teach me more about how you operate. If you've got new buying practices that you'd like to tell us about, that would be incredibly useful. But we can also work with you via advertisers as well. So if there's any advertisers that we're working with that you work closely with, we'd be very happy to collaborate and get everyone's expertise in the right areas. Going back to my slide of us, marketing science people shaking hands with everyone else, we don't have to have this data walled off. If people were concerned about sharing actual results, we can potentially share indexed results. There's normally a way of sharing data to allow everyone to contribute and find better ways of executing and planning going forwards.
I think there might be something in the chat as well. Any more questions? We're free to add some more in there. Here we go. Seb, this is from Seb. As an agency, how would you get a brand on board for MMM? Do you tend to find certain teams within a brand are reluctant to pass over information? Or do you ever find there's any legal or compliance issues?
We rarely have legal or compliance issues. On the whole, that doesn't seem to be a concern for us. A lot of advertisers have ways of working with market mix model vendors, so yeah, we don't tend to find too many blockers there. In terms of getting people on board, I think the way I see it is that we should be providing insights that make making decisions easier, because there's, as I've kind of alluded to before, so many decisions that you can be making. If you've got a large mix of channels that you work across, lots of different decisions per channel to make, that's a really difficult task. I think agencies, people work with, can be incredibly under the pump, just trying to look at how can they make the best decision possible with the information that they have. So to get them on board, it should be about how we're trying to simplify their lives, not how we're trying to make it more complicated. Yes, we need data from them, so there can be the work required for that, and so much of our effort goes into trying to make that as simple a process as possible. But the outcome should be that we're simplifying their world, and ongoing after that point, everything should become easier because we have this map of how we can be embedding those outputs into their processes. They have the right information to make the right decision. So that's ultimately how we would look to try and get brands on board.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Seb, for that question. And we've got another one here from Andy Metcalf. How do you currently get access to exposure data from publishers, and how will this be impacted by cookie deprecation?
Yeah, so digital, we have a couple of ways. Normally we use Supermetrics to link up to the digital publishers, and that helps the data flow through. Now, cookie deprecation doesn't impact that because we're looking at levels of impressions, or impression counts, rather than looking for who and where an impression occurred. So that's why they're fairly, they're unimpacted by cookie deprecation, etc. And they're privacy first because they're not looking at individuals. They're just looking at in any given week, what was the total number of impressions that got served at that time. So I think there's another part to that question. Can you remind me?
Yeah, you're right. Just how you get access to the exposure data from a publisher.
Yeah. So yeah, digital, we normally link up, and the likes of Meta and Google have MMM APIs that we can link up to as well. So they're very much on board with this as a measurement approach and looking to make it as straightforward to get that impression data as possible. Obviously, we need the advertiser's consent to do so. And then for the likes of your above the line activities, that's where we work closely with agencies ultimately to get that information coming through as well. We always look at where we can be building third-party partnerships so we can go directly to publishers to get that data from them, so that we're not having to have data passed from one party to another before it finally gets to us. So we're always looking at how we can try and streamline that process of getting that data.
So, Will, you said that like the data is, at that impression level, so not, not impacted by cookie deprecation. But if a publisher or an agency had reach data, so, privacy compliantly collected, reach data, does that help the model? Like, does it improve accuracy if you can have that data, or it doesn't have an impact?
For us at the moment, it doesn't. So we're looking, the things we care about, how much you spend on a publisher and the exposure from that publisher. So impressions, ultimately. Reach can be a tough one because market mix models use reach on a weekly basis. So seeing reach week in, week out, you can't aggregate reach. You don't know if it's to what extent you've got unique reach or duplicated reach over certain weeks. So it can be quite a hard signal to use. So we're just looking at total impressions, how many impressions you were getting out there and the spend. But that's not to say that it won't change in the future. And as we get better at getting reach and frequency data to unlock further insights, because again, those are core requirements when it comes to planning and buying, understanding how you set those parameters.
Awesome, thank you. So we've got one here around the methodology for granular insights you gather in regards to attribution back to channels and formats. Is it pixel-based or survey-based? Are there channels that are trickier to measure than others? And are there any considerations around the ideal combination of channels and formats? So I think we've got the around the impressions is all you need in terms of data. But are there, I guess, some channels trickier than others to measure in models?
Tends to be non-digital channels. Not difficult in terms of to measure. The good thing is that every channel is measured in the same way. So as I mentioned before, it's not harder to measure TV than it is to measure digital. It can be harder to get the more granular data for some of those above the line channels. So getting really accurate, let's say out of home, there's lots of different formats that you can be looking at in out of home. And we'd love to understand what level of impressions you had against those different formats. Not everyone has that data to hand. And I think this is a huge opportunity for a lot of people. Everyone wants to be data driven and harness the power of data, but not everyone's taking control of the data that they should have access to. So it's starting to manage the activity that they've run and having that data to hand to unlock opportunities like this. So advertisers who are going to get more out of market mix models are those advertisers and agencies who've really been quite rigorous in collecting and storing that information, knowing how the exposure levels on different channels, on different formats, going back multiple years. That's absolute gold for those advertisers and agencies. And it's so important for them to take control and to manage it. And it's so much easier than trying to collect and store customer level data. So in some ways, it's an opportunity because it should be so much easier than some of the data work people have had to do in the past. All you're doing is storing weekly level impressions against formats, etc. Hope that makes sense.
And are there a minimum number of channels that you need to be running to get the benefit out of market mix modelling? Having said, you said that you need variations, I guess, in the activity to help the model.
I'd probably flip that round and say there's more value if you've got more channels to make decisions across. So one of the most impactful areas that you can be making decisions on is your channel mix. If you're only using one or two channels, then there's not as many decisions to be informing via a market mix model. So it's more about just where you can be putting in, where you can be inputting those decisions. And if you're only making one or two channel decisions, the value is less to you ultimately. If you're using 10 channels, then actually it's being very valuable. And then it doesn't really matter how many channels you use. That's not such an important factor for the model. It's more of a factor for how much value you can generate from the insights.
Awesome. Thank you. This one's from Tracy. Thank you, Tracy Harbour. In your experience, how long on average would you say it takes to get the full benefit from doing market mix modelling? And does that differ by industry? And I think probably category of advertiser, I think. There.
I mean, the benefit can be related to planning cycles ultimately. So it's great if when you get results, you're at the start of a planning cycle and you can straight away be looking at how you can amend your media plan based off the insights. So we sometimes talk about this, ensuring value in 90 days. So when your model gets built, you've got the insights. After 30 days, you go away and use the insights to action them, and then 30 days later you go and measure them. So it should actually be quite a almost immediate source of value, because you can immediately action the insights and look at in the short term what they returned. So yeah, I don't think there should be a drawn out time period between an MMM and getting value from it.
Awesome. I think could be another one in here. Hang on. Okay, this one's from Cam. How does the Mutinex solve revenue attribution for a two-sided marketplace business, e.g. vendors posting listings on a platform versus audience consumer demand and engagement on listings? Is that defining the long-term link between changes in audience and listing supply is enormous challenge, to say the least. Do you understand the question? I'm not sure.
Is it about demand supply, or can you read it one more time? I think I've got it.
Yeah. So how does Mutinex solve revenue attribution for a two-sided marketplace business? So vendors posting listings on a platform versus audience and consumer demand engagement on listings. So they sort of have the two revenue sources coming in.
Yeah, so let's say you've got a car marketplace, which is dependent on people actually publishing ads for cars and actually having people go in. Yeah, we have got a couple of marketplace customers actually. And, you know, for us, it's all about what drives revenue. So we often look at what is driving the posters ultimately. What's driving people to push an ad onto that marketplace. But actually, for a lot of these customers, we do have multiple models. So we're also looking at how your media drives people to drive ads, and how does that media drive people to your site, ultimately, like site visits, and then a conversion value off the back of it. So yeah, it's a really interesting one, but often with these, we want to be measuring your source of revenue, which is ultimately about what's driving ads to be published to your marketplace. But alongside that, we can run a secondary model to say, how is your media also driving traffic to your site, which has that, as has been called out, just that relationship, because you're not going to get people posting if you're not going to get people to your site. So yeah, we tend to do it by looking at two different metrics as target metrics.
Thank you. Thanks for that question, Cam. Any more questions? Please, please post in. Well, if people have got more questions afterwards, they can certainly approach the IAB and send those through, and we might be able to answer those at a later time. But thank you so much, Will, for your time today. Sorry for the stress we caused you getting on, but all went very smoothly once you were here.
Yeah, no, glad I made it on. I was getting worried it wasn't going to happen.
Oh, good. And thank you, everybody, for attending. It's been great questions, and I hope that was really useful for you. So.